We now come to the tribute to Sir Tony Lloyd. Before we proceed with the main business, I would like to have the opportunity to remember our late colleague, Sir Tony. I first met Tony almost 30 years ago when I was standing as the candidate in Chorley in the 1997 election. Tony was Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister, and he came to Chorley, he came along to Adlington, the village I live in, and on Sutton Lane he was knocking on the doors. I've got to say, it was his charm, passion and good humour that helped convince those wavering voters to vote for me. So I'm always forever in his debt. Of course, Tony had been in the Commons for quite some time before me. In total, he served the people of Greater Manchester for 45 years. He was first elected as a member of Trafford Council in 1979, and in 1983 he was elected this House as the member for his hometown of Stratford. In 1997, he returned for Manchester Central. By that time, he'd been part of the Labour front bench team for over a decade, and Tony Blair appointed him Minister of State in the Foreign Office, serving under Robin Cook. He remained active in international affairs after leaving the FCO, as leader of the UK delegations to the Parliamentary Assembly on the Council of Europe, the Western European Union and the OSCE. He was chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party from 2006 to 2012, the longest-serving holder of that role during that last Labour government. He stood down as the Member of Parliament to become the first elected Police and Crime Commissioner for Greater Manchester. But he returned. He returned to the House for the Member of Parliament for Rochdale in 2017. Tony remained an active member of this House until very recently. In one of his final speeches in this chamber just last month, he concluded by saying, "I think the message that has come across today is that we must fight for change, that we want to seek to take place." That is a first summary of Tony's attitude to public service. He was truly a great Member of Parliament. However, although he took politics seriously, Tony didn't take himself seriously. He had a very dry, even mischievous sense of humour. But overwhelmingly, he left an impression of kindness and decency with those who dealt with him. I've got to say, Tony was an impressive Member of Parliament. He was an impressive person. But his politics was shaped by his mother. His father died young, and his mother introduced him into the Labour movement. And it was the Labour movement that shaped the person that we talk about today. So I've got to say, I will always be in awe of the kindness, his generosity, and the support that he always gave me. Even on that day, as he came out of hospital, Tony was thinking of others. I was pleased to have had a chance to have a chat with him, to share a few jokes, reminisce a bit. But typical of Tony, because one of the most difficult things you have to do is phone somebody whose life is coming to an end. And I wondered how I could make that phone call. But I've got to tell you, Tony made it so easy for me. And it was that kind of person. He put me at ease when it was meant to be the other way around. But that's the person that we're talking about. So he made sure it wasn't a difficult conversation. I didn't know that that would be the last time we'd ever speak, but I'm so glad that we did. We've not only lost a great colleague and friend, the country has lost one of the nicest and most effective MPs. But while we're in this House, and those who work for him mourn his loss, our thoughts are with the family who are watching the tributes today. From the gallery, his wife, Judith, his children and his great-granddaughters. I hope the tributes will give them some comfort that Tony was much loved by all sides of the House. May you rest in peace, dear Tony. I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer. On a point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The death of Sir Tony Lloyd last week was a great loss to so many people on these benches and beyond. But the sadness we feel pales in comparison to the grief that Tony's family is going through. Our hearts are with them. And I'm pleased that some of Tony's family are in the gallery today. His wife, Judith, his children, Angarad, Siobhan, Kieran and Alexandria, his son-in-law, Paul, his nephew, Sean, who I know was like a son to him, and of course his sister, Vivian. Mr. Speaker, like you, I hope they can take some comfort in the memories and tributes of colleagues today, and I hope they see just how much Tony was loved and respected here in this House, and how much he managed to achieve in his decades of public service. Mr. Speaker, I first met Tony when I was Director of Public Prosecutions and he was the Police and Crime Commissioner in Greater Manchester. We were at a sexual assault referral clinic in Greater Manchester, St Mary's, which works with organisations and individuals committed to combating violence against women and girls, providing safe places for women and girls to report what has happened to them. It is an incredible model. And I saw firsthand Tony's commitment to tackling violence against women and girls. And what really struck me when I met him for that first time was that he had the heart of a true public servant. Not grandstanding, not pretending that he had all the answers, but quietly, respectfully, working with others to deliver. And like others, I've been deeply moved, Mr. Speaker, to read and hear the many tributes to Tony, not just from these benches, but from members across the House. And I thank members across the House for the comfort they will have given Tony's family in the tributes that they have paid to him. Tributes also from the trade union movement, because Tony was a committed trade unionist, and from people who met Tony in his decades of public service. And like you, Mr. Speaker, it meant a great deal to me personally to have the opportunity to speak directly to Tony when he left hospital for the last time, the Thursday before he died, Thursday week ago. I was able to convey to him firsthand the high esteem in which he was held by everyone, and I hope that it did give him some comfort and support in those final days. Tony was held in special high esteem by his staff, Jacob, Iftikhar, Beverly, Ajira, Megan and Chris, and of course Tricia, his close friend and political confidant in Rochdale. Mr. Speaker, indeed, many of those in Tony's tight-knit group of friends used to work for him, and I know that they were by his side in his final days. That is a true tribute to Tony. He treated people as kindly and warmly behind closed doors as he did publicly, and he treated those who worked for him with the respect and dignity he expected everybody to be treated with. And Mr. Speaker, some members of the House know that Tony followed the Reds on two fronts. He was committed to the Labour Party, but he was also a passionate supporter of Manchester United. Now, Tony and I agreed on a lot of things, Mr. Speaker, but not on that. But as we all know, his love for Manchester went beyond football. A former Irish ambassador who I've got to know well, and who worked closely with Tony when he was the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, remembered receiving from Tony what he described as a whimsical Mancunian take on Irish history, which showed not just Tony's typical knowledge of his subject, but the great sense of humour and poignancy that he was known for. Across the country, Tony had huge impact as the MP for Rochdale. Across the United Kingdom, he championed cooperation, collaboration and communities. And across the world, he promoted peace, chairing Labour Friends of Ukraine, supporting human rights and democracy in Belarus. Yet, he still always had the time for the little things that matter so much to members of this House. A friendly word, some encouragement, with that twinkle in his eye which everybody who's ever met him knows and will remember. And Mr. Speaker, just a few days before he died, Tony published what would turn out to be his final article in his local paper. He wrote about his hopes for 2024, for peace in the Middle East and across the world, He wrote of the need to help the NHS off its knees, particularly having just experienced its care firsthand. He wrote of the importance of action on climate change to make sure that we can pass our planet on to our children. And he wrote about education and the need to invest in young people. Tony might not be able to lead the fight for that better world he hoped for, but those of us he leaves behind will. And we will have him in mind as we continue to fight for the causes that he was passionate about, the values he lived, and the people he served throughout his entire life. May he rest in peace. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the whole House was deeply saddened by the loss of one of our longest-serving and most respected members, Sir Tony Lloyd. I offer my sincere condolences and those of the whole government to his wife Judith, their children and grandchildren, and to all his friends and family. Tony and I, of course, came from different political traditions, but I deeply respected him as a man of great integrity, compassion and humour, a gentle but fierce advocate for his constituents and his values, and a dedicated parliamentarian. He loved this House, he said, for the shenanigans of the place, and it said everything about his pragmatic and warm approach to politics that we have heard and will hear so many heartfelt tributes to him from all sides of this House. And for Tony, politics was always about people. And that began, of course, with his constituents in Rochdale and his home city of Manchester. Born in Stretford, within cheering distance of his beloved Old Trafford, he spent 36 years as a Member of Parliament and served as a Police and Crime Commissioner, truly living up to his nickname, Mr. Manchester. Tony gave an interview while recovering from COVID that gives you the full measure of the man. All of Tony's humanity is there, his empathy, his values. He talked of watching a young nurse gently feeding an old man opposite and reflecting, in his words, that there is so much more to life than the next parcel from Amazon. It's what binds us together as a human family, that enormous decency. Tony was an enormously decent man who gave his life to public service, from local government to crime to Northern Ireland, and perhaps most enduringly in foreign affairs. He was a principled and tireless public servant who made a real difference to the lives of people here and around the world. Mr. Speaker, as you said in his penultimate contribution in this House, Tony said that change can happen and we must fight for the change that we want to see. From the beginning of his career right to the end, Tony Lloyd lived those words. He was a great family man, a great man of Manchester, and a great man of the House of Commons. He will be missed, but he and the change he fought for and achieved will never be forgotten.
SNP spokesperson Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to send our sincere condolences to Tony's family from the SNP benches, and I want to say a few words personally about Tony. I didn't know him very well, but one very vivid recollection. One evening in the COVID tent that was set up on the terrace, I went to meet an SNP colleague for a little light refreshment. And at the table with her was Tony Lloyd and Stephen Pound. Mr. Speaker, we almost got thrown out of that COVID tent, not because we were drinking so much, but because we were laughing so much. I think every time someone said something, either Stephen or Tony, and maybe a wee bit myself and my colleague, we just capped each other. And those who were in that tent probably remember the rocket. I mean, everyone was looking at us and wondering what it was we found so funny. I can't remember what it was we found so funny, but it just was one of those evenings where you go away feeling better. And thereafter, every time I met Tony, he spoke to me. I probably fully understand what his family are going through, having been widowed myself. And my late husband used to say, Marion Hen, most people get into politics to help other people. And I think that was Tony. And I'm so glad I met him. I spoke to him very recently in the chamber, and he gave me his lovely smile, nodded and asked me how I was. And the day felt better. It's a bit presumptuous of me to say that things get better, but I know they do. I also know that it's always best to look back and remember those we love who are gone with a smile, and I'm sure that will be easy in time for Tony's family.
Father of the House.
Order, Mr. Speaker. One of the interesting quotations in Wikipedia has Tony Lloyd's words, "The basic morality of politics was instilled in me. I've always thought, if not fighting for what's right and just, then what is politics for?" My recommendation to anybody coming into this place, and one I try to take myself, is try to earn the tributes which Tony Lloyd has earned.
Graham Stridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we have the sad duty to pay tribute to honourable or right honourable members, it's often the case that the facts get gilded in an attempt to help the family. There is absolutely no need to embellish the facts when it comes to Tony. Quite simply, Tony was a decent man who dedicated his life to public service. He was first elected to Trafford Council the same day that Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. That meant his first 18 years as an elected representative were probably more difficult than most people's first 18 years. He very soon, 4 years after he'd been elected as a councillor, became the Member of Parliament for Stretford. That had two things that I want to mention. It meant that he represented Manchester United and Manchester City, both grounds were in that constituency. And Tony, who had been fair with all his constituents all his life, I suspect he was not completely even-handed between the Reds and the Blues of Manchester. He was delighted to go into the director's box at Old Trafford, and I think the last EDM he put down was a very good tribute to Bobby Charlton when he passed away recently. One of the sadnesses of Tony passing is that he campaigned against and led a debate in Westminster Hall against the Glazers' parasitic ownership of Manchester United. And I think as the Glazers are on the way out, Tony would have been delighted to see their doings. When he became MP for Stretford, which included Moss Side, shortly afterwards I became leader of the council, and we both had to deal with many of the problems that there were in Moss Side at that time. I think it would be fair to say that Tony worked tirelessly to improve the relationships between the different communities and the public services in Moss Side, because we were still in the aftermath of the 1981 riots in Moss Side. I think it's also fair to say, and he took us into his job later as Commissioner of Police, he was not a supporter of James Anderton's rather brutal tactics in Moss Side, and he saw it as part of his job to improve relations between the communities, not to make them worse. And he took a similar attitude to that when he moved to Central, because though he loved representing Manchester United, he was always the political realist and could see that there was likely to be a much larger majority in Manchester Central than there was in Stretford. So he moved to Manchester Central, and again a difficult ward in Cheetham, where he dedicated his time to improving relations in that ward. And I think, he never said this to me directly, but I think it was his experience of seeing the damage that poor policing could do that motivated him to become the Police and Crime Commissioner for Greater Manchester. And in some ways, more importantly, he was the first non-elected mayor for Greater Manchester, where he used those skills of bringing communities together, so bringing the 10 local authorities of Greater Manchester together, because Greater Manchester has a reputation for the authorities working together. That doesn't just happen on its own. Yeah. Authorities are often jealous of each other. Leaders of councils are jealous of members of parliament. They're certainly jealous of mayors, elected or not. And Tony used his skills to bring people together. Tony was calm, which didn't mean to say he always towed the party line. On Iraq, for instance, and on Trident, I was pleased to walk through the lobbies with him. He did not agree with the current Labour Party policy on the Middle East, but again, it was done in a calm and thoughtful way. When the War Memorial in Rochdale was desecrated with pro-Palestinian, anti-British government writing and by people chanting racist, anti-Semitic slogans, Tony was the first person to call it out. I think this House, the people of Rochdale, the people of Greater Manchester, will greatly miss Tony's contribution to our political life.
Yeah. Sir William Cash.
It's with great sadness that I stand and say goodbye to Tony Lloyd. He was a man of great courtesy. He was a great parliamentarian, and I'm so glad that both the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister have paid such fulsome tributes to him. I much enjoyed his company when I had the opportunity to speak to him, but also to recognise his independence of mind, as Member for Gorton has just said, regarding the question of Iraq, which was a huge issue for the people on the Labour side. He spoke for the Labour Party with an independence of mind and with authority, which certainly attracted me to listen to what he had to say when he spoke. I would also like to pay tribute to him, not only as the Mayor of Greater Manchester, but also as the member for Rochdale. And I, just as a personal anecdote, would like to put on record my thanks in 2017 when he helped to organise and spoke at the commemoration of John Bright in Rochdale Quaker Cemetery, and played a very important part, not only in putting the event together, but also in the celebration and commemoration that took place afterwards. He recognised the greatness of other people's contributions, such as that of John Bright in the history of Rochdale, and his commitment to democracy. And I can only say that as the member for Rochdale himself, now, and sadly no longer, he represented the very best that people such as John Bright represented in Rochdale when he himself was a member of Parliament here in this country for so long. So I just want to pay tribute to his family, my condolences to Judith and the family, and to say thank you, Tony, for all you did.
Ed David.
Speaker, I hope these heartfelt tributes to Sir Tony Lloyd are a source of comfort to his family. Those of us who were lucky to know him for a little while knew him to be an absolutely lovely man, kind, respected on all sides of the house. You should be really proud of him. And I say to the Labour family, I know he was an integral part of the Labour Party for so many years. I know you're proud of him, justifiably so. He stood up for Labour Party principles and his own principles as an individual MP representing his constituency. I've spoken to Liberal Democrat colleagues in Manchester who remember him as a sort of person who would reach out to other parties to make sure that the people of Manchester, the people of his constituencies, were the prime objective in the work that politicians of all parties were trying to do. And it was no surprise that he decided to leave this house and go and be the Police and Crime Commissioner, where he served with real distinction to try to make the lives better of everyone in Manchester. He was a Mancunian at his heart, as we heard from the former leader of the council. I also remember him as a strong internationalist. It's a real theme from the work that he did. In his last speech, I think, in the last debate in this House, he was supporting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and standing up for that. He voted against the Iraq War. He was an internationalist and put his beliefs above everything else there. My personal experience with him was actually both listening to him in this House, where his calm and thoughtful and respectful interventions were often heard in silence because people wanted to hear what Sir Tony had to say. My particular remembrance was on a cross-party visit that we made to Israel-Palestine in 2009. And we went to towns in southern Israel, Ashkelon, we went to the West Bank, and we went to Gaza. And we were on the border crossing in Gaza, and we weren't being let in. It was a pre-arranged trip, but we weren't being allowed in, and we were there for several hours. We rang the British ambassador. That didn't work. But Tony had the idea of ringing the BBC. And within an hour, the BBC were reporting that a cross-party group of British MPs weren't being allowed in to Gaza. And it was amazing how quickly we were allowed in. That showed the measure of Tony, a principled pragmatist, getting through, understanding how things worked. And my advice to colleagues, when you go on foreign trips, always take a former Foreign Office Minister. It's really come to quite handy. But we won't forget him. No one who met him, whether they were constituents, members of his house, or frankly anyone around the world who met him, will never forget Tony. He will live in our hearts and our memories.
Colonel Bradley.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to be called in this debate. I feel humble, really, to be able to speak about Tony. He shadowed me when I was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and it was always a pleasure and an honour to be able to have a private conversation with him. And yes, across the dispatch box, we might have our disagreements, but behind the scenes, I knew that we could have a proper, open, frank conversation. And I would say this about conversations with Tony: every one of them I learned something from. Every single time we spoke, there was something new. There was a different perspective. There was a different way of thinking about things that Tony gave me. And he helped me enormously in the task we both had to try and restore devolved government to Northern Ireland at the time I was Secretary of State, and he shadowed me. After that time, we remained close and would regularly chat about Northern Ireland and what was going on. We often talked about football as well, despite supporting teams from the other side of Manchester in my case. But we always had a great conversation, and he was always generous and warm and witty. I was very, very honoured that last month he was able to co-chair with me, co-host with me, an event that the BGIPU held to mark the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Tony being Tony, he went round every stall, every possible person met Tony. He was warm, he was kind, he was generous, and they knew that he was engaged and listening to them, which is something that's a rare quality often in people that we come across. Last week, my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow North, and I were both at a conference for the BGIPU, and our admin official was Joe Perry, who is the newest recruit to the BGIPU. Joe worked in Tony's office for many years, and it was a real, you could just see how much Joe was affected by the loss of Tony, the shock of it, but also just the sense of loss of somebody so special to him, somebody who'd given him so much. I'm very pleased that the three of us were able to spend a little bit of time where we toasted Tony. We found somewhere he'd like, and it was nice to be able to raise a glass to a good friend and someone we will all miss desperately.
Chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party, John Cryer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like you, I met Tony, I think probably around 30 years ago, in the run-up to the 1997 election, and I thought then and continue to think ever since what a tolerant and restrained, even when he felt strongly, what a tolerant and restrained sort of man he was. I have to say I wasn't particularly tolerant or restrained in those days, and I like to think I learned something from Tony, which I think I did over the years, and those qualities stood him in great stead when he became chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party. I mean, he took over at a time when the tensions between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, I'm being slightly euphemistic, the tensions between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were at their sharpest, and he was able to guide the PLP through that period. It's extraordinary to think that when Tony came into this place, Michael Foot was leader of the Labour Party, and I think I'm right in thinking that he served under 9 Labour leaders. On longevity, I'm sure I remember many years ago Tony telling me that he saw, as a young boy, he saw the Busby Babes play with the great Duncan Edwards, and he must have been one of the last people still alive who could say they saw Manchester United before the Munich crash. So I'd just like to say, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, that tolerance and that restraint was absolutely an exemplar. And there's an awful lot of people, not just in here but outside as well, who could really usefully learn a few lessons from Tony.
Greg Clark.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to add my condolences to those of colleagues for a man who commanded universal respect across this House and indeed beyond. And although for most of my time as a Member of Parliament, Tony was a fellow MP, I got to know him best when he was out of the House of Commons, when he was the first Mayor of Greater Manchester, following on from being Police and Crime Commissioner, indeed combining the two. He was appointed on the 29th of May 2015, 2 weeks after I had been appointed Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, and it was an absolute pleasure to work very closely with Tony during those 2 years. Creating the first city mayor, big city mayor outside Greater London was a big deal. This hadn't been done for many decades, and so it was very important that it should be a success, not only for Greater Manchester that was coming on to elect the next mayor, but for the whole of the country, wanting to encourage other great cities across the UK to follow this route. So the first mayor was crucial, and Tony was elected by borough leaders across Greater Manchester, and he proved to be the perfect inaugural mayor. His easygoing charm, his ability to work well not only with the three parties who at that time were leading the boroughs of Greater Manchester, but with a Conservative government, and the experience that he had of this place and indeed of ministerial office, built the confidence in that role of Mayor of Greater Manchester, the confidence that it could be entrusted with powers and responsibilities devolved from this place that proved to be a template not just for further devolution to Greater Manchester, but for the whole of the country. I enjoyed working with Tony during this time for his courteousness, his effectiveness, but also his tenacity, as I'm sure colleagues across the House will remember. Without his sure-footed leadership, not only the mayoralty of Greater Manchester, but those of other city regions may not have taken root in the way that they have. Tony wasn't one, as has been said, to trumpet his own attributes and achievements. But in those 2 short years as Mayor of Greater Manchester, he gave a great legacy, not just to the city of which he was so proud, but to the country as a whole. We send him and his family our sincere condolences.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first met Tony Lloyd in 1988. My husband Colin and I were looking for help with putting on an Amnesty International showing of artwork celebrating the 40th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And I contacted Tony, whom I hadn't met previously, and then he helped us to arrange to stage the showing of those artworks at Manchester Central Library. We also managed to have a fantastic launch event at the library featuring Tony and some actors from Coronation Street. So I think it was typical of Tony, the wholeheartedness with which he supported what we wanted to do with that event on human rights. Tony was the MP for Stretford at the time I became a councillor in Trafford Council. Having been a Trafford councillor himself, as we've heard, Tony was a great mentor for all of us new councillors elected when we won Trafford Council in 1995. And I can remember Tony and Judith at our Trafford Labour social events, and in particular his very good salsa dancing. Tony has a remarkable record of service as an MP in Trafford and Manchester, our Police and Crime Commissioner, Interim Mayor, and most recently as the MP for Rochdale. And of course he was the long-serving chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party. In all these roles, Tony had a substantial influence on our political life, particularly in Greater Manchester and in the North West, but more widely in his role as a committed internationalist. The final thing I want to pay tribute to is Tony Lloyd's sheer decency and humanity. I want to thank him for his friendship and support across the years, and I want to send love to Judith, to Angarad, Siwan, Kieran, Alexandra, all the family and Tony's staff. We will miss him terribly.
Yeah. Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to talk for long because there are lots of people who knew Tony better than I did, but for the past 4 years I had the privilege of sharing a borough with him. I was his constituency neighbour, and a better neighbour and friend you probably couldn't have asked for. I was trying to think of anecdotes I could sort of use to sum up how good a friend he was to me, but as has been alluded to, Tony's sense of humour was very, very dry, and it means I can't repeat quite a few of those anecdotes in the chamber. So I just wanted to touch on sort of a couple of incidents. The first one being on the 13th of December, when a very bleary-eyed, newly elected MP for Hayward and Middleton reached out of the bed to grab their phone, which was ringing, and it was Tony on the other end of it, in a lot better condition than I was, clearly. And he said, I think we should probably get together so I can get you up to speed. I mean, this was the man who'd just been through quite a tough election, and his first thought was getting his constituents' needs dealt with, because obviously there's been a transition in the other side of the borough. And there's a lovely story that goes off the back of it, but it's not repeatable, so get me in strangers later. But I have to say, I mean, that was the mark of the man. I mean, we're talking about the spirit of cooperativism that is Rochdale. Tony embodied that. And that service never really waned, even when his health did. Most recently, I spoke with him one-on-one at the Holodomor commemorations. I mean, Tony did fantastic work with the Ukrainian community, especially in our borough. And we were stood there in the freezing cold, as you do. And I was close enough to him at that point to ask about how his treatment was going. And he started asking questions about how I was doing, personally. He was just so sanguine about it, and he just kept going. I mean, we were exchanging casework pretty much up to the last. This was a man who gave his all for something he really cared about. He was a parliamentarian, but he was also a fantastic local community representative. We use a lot of superlatives in this job. We talk about things being awesome and big and grand. A word that carries still a lot more weight for me is good. And Tony didn't just do good, he was good.
Yeah. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A lot's been said about our friend Tony Lloyd, the service he gave to the people of Greater Manchester over his long and distinguished career. Trafford Councillor, MP for Stretford, MP for Manchester Central, Police and Crime Commissioner for Greater Manchester, the Interim Mayor of Greater Manchester, MP for Rochdale, Minister, Shadow Minister. We can rattle them all off. Tony was a friend, somebody who I will miss greatly. And I first got to know Tony at the 1992 summer Young Labour residential. I was young once. And I'm billing it as a residential. It was actually in Manchester. It was at the GMB National College in Whalley Range. It's now my honourable friend's constituency office, the member for Manchester Gorton, as the Muslim Heritage Centre, but back then it was the GMB National College. And we had a number of MPs from across the North West region and beyond coming to talk to all these eager young Labour activists, a little bit dejected because we've been through a general election we should have won, and of course we didn't, but the rest was history. And Tony didn't just come to the college and chat to us youngsters. He stayed with us afterwards. Everybody else disappeared. They had more important things to do. But Tony stayed with us to encourage us, to keep up the fight, to stand for what you believe in. And he did like a beer and did even do the karaoke afterwards. But he was all about supporting young people, encouraging them into politics, encouraging them to chase their dreams, to follow their dreams. And I didn't think he'd remember this, but when I was elected in 2005 as the MP for Denton and Reddish, he came over to me in the members' tea room and he said, "I remember you doing karaoke, Andrew." I said, "Well, Tony, I remember you doing karaoke, and it wasn't that great." We served together over the last 19 years in this place. We sat in the shadow cabinet together, and he was a great shadow Northern Ireland secretary, really believed in reaching out across the communities and ensuring that you bring people together. He fought for internationalism, whether it was the people of Colombia, whether it was the people of Palestine, or the Kashmiri people that I've done a lot of work with Tony in his role as MP for Rochdale. He was a socialist, an internationalist. He believed in social justice. He was an exceptional public servant. He was both a gentleman and a gentleman. God bless you, Tony. And thank you to Judith, the family and the staff for sharing such a lovely man with the Labour Party. Thank you.
Anthony Bagnall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm deeply honoured to be able to speak, as I served with Tony on the Trade Select Committee for 3 years. And he was always there to give this young upstart some pretty good, impartial advice. He was kind, generous, always had a balanced view about what should and shouldn't be done, had the best interests of Parliament at his heart, and it was an extraordinary service to Parliament and an extraordinary example to any young member entering this place. I wrote to him last year when he fell ill, and in the midst of his treatment he sent me back a letter, not complaining, not uttering anything about his own personal circumstances, but just saying how much he missed being in this place and how much he was looking forward to getting back to here. And I saw him a few months or a month ago, and I was so pleased to be able to have just a last word with him and say what an extraordinary example he was to so many. And I did think back about what would be an acceptable anecdote to tell, and at one point went up to speak to him and said, "I'm a bit stuck, Tony. I've got a constituency engagement coming up, and I'm not entirely sure what the funny story is that I'll be able to tell, and whether or not this happened to him or it was one of those apocryphal stories." He looked at me and he said, "Well, how about this one?" And he said, "I had a couple of constituents come and see me in Central Lobby, a mother, a father, and a son. And they were standing in Central Lobby as the division bell went, and the doorkeepers and the police were all shuffling about, and the father said to the mother, 'What's that? What does that mean?' And the boy, out of nowhere, says, 'It means one of them's escaped.'" I think that was his gift to me, was a good sense of humour, and now it's passed on to all of you to use at your association events. He was an extraordinary man. I am so pleased and fortunate to have ever been able to meet him, and I send my very best to his family.
Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to begin by saying my thoughts are with the Tony's family who are there in the gallery, and also with his staff, past and present. I know many of them will be mourning a man who made a great impact in their lives. I knew Tony for well over 25 years as a colleague and a friend. We both, of course, shared the two red idea that we both had. and I can say one of the Reds clearly is coming up nicely, and I hope the football team also gets better. The other thing I shared with Tony was actually the community relations, the work in the whole Greater Manchester, and I really find him absolutely incredible. And as a colleague, as someone who was also like a mentor to me when I joined the Labour Party, he helped me through many of the great challenges, the fights that I've gone through politically, and that including winning my seat in the Cheetham Hill from Lib Dem, someone I think David may have known, late Qasim Afzal. And then when I became a member of European Parliament, at that time, of course, that fight was with Nick Griffin, who represented the North West. And again, he was absolutely a star. He knew exactly what needs to be done at the right time and what needs to be said. And then same when he came to George Galloway. So I've had my share both from the left and the right. I always found Tony to be absolutely a gem, and with the experience that he had, the balanced idea, the clarity of the thought that he had, I always found myself in a good place. He was unfailingly a warm, a friendly, and a kind individual. He could always be relied on for a support, whatever campaign or issue you were working on, and always available to intervene in obscure Westminster Hall adjournment debate. And despite being a gentle and modest, he was a sharp politician who knew exactly how this place worked and how he could use it to get the best for his constituents. And I know that because Tony represented Whalley Range, which is in my constituency now, even now there are long-term residents who fondly tell how he sorted their housing or their immigration or whatever issues that they had. So some 30 years ago, they still remember Tony. As a councillor, as a member of Parliament, Police and Crime Commissioner, interim mayor, Tony touched the lives of everyone, I would say, in Greater Manchester. He'll be missed here in Parliament, but most importantly, he'll be missed by people back home in Manchester and Rochdale, who he never missed the opportunity to champion. May he rest in peace. Thank you.
Sir Graham Blady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful for the chance to participate in this. Tony was a calm and decent man and a gentleman. When I was elected in 1997, I was one of two Conservative MPs in Greater Manchester, and in 2001, I was one of one Conservative MP in Greater Manchester. And Tony, right from the start, was one of those who helped to set the tone for the way in which we all, regardless of party, work together in the interests of the city and the region. It was something I always valued enormously. And I think it's an example to all members to think of how we serve the wider public, not just our parties or our own interest. Oddly then, the other thing that I wanted to say in giving my condolences to the family and paying tribute to Tony is that I then came across him again, in particular, in 2010 when I was elected chairman of the 1922 committee, and Tony was the chairman of the PLP. And there we both were in our respective party roles, but also finding ourselves working together, perhaps more often than I'd ever expected. And that's something I've found since with his two successors in my time as chairman of the 22. And I always valued his advice. It's remarkable how often he was able to give advice from his experience in dealing with the PLP, and just giving me a little bit of experienced guidance then as the new boy looking after the 1922 committee. He will be missed, and I think he sets an example for us all, which I hope will be followed. Thank you.
Gregory Camp.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to pass on my sincere condolences and sympathies to the family of Tony on his passing. I got to know Tony Lloyd just after his return, Mr. Speaker, to the House here in 2017. And then when he was appointed Northern Ireland spokesperson for the Labour Party, a very senior member of the Labour Party, whose ultimate responsibility it was when that person was coming to Northern Ireland was to meet with the innocent victims of terrorism. And despite my best efforts to get that person to meet them, Tony came to me and said, I will meet them, Gregory. And I said, thank you very much, Tony. I arranged a meeting, and it was the first time I had been in a close proximity to Tony in a meeting where there was a small group of people as opposed to the chamber. And initially I felt deeply touched by his empathy and how he listened to the trauma of many people who'd suffered at the hands of terror, and how he very calmly and patiently responded to each and every person. And I deeply appreciated that. But what struck me even more, Mr. Speaker, was after he finished his term as Labour frontbench spokesperson on Northern Ireland, and he no longer had that responsibility, he sat behind me here in the chamber, tapped me on the shoulder one day and said, Gregory, I would like to meet those people again. He didn't have to, he didn't need to, but he did. And again he showed and demonstrated his empathy. And Mr. Speaker, I was reminded this morning in preparation for these few words that all of our mortality is something that at this occasion we should be reminded of. And as the old book says, what does God require of us? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. Thank you.
Rebecca Longbailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tony was one of the best of us, a decent, kind man dedicated to helping people. As we've heard today, he was often unassuming and never showboating the brilliant work he was doing. Such was his commitment to public service, he rarely felt comfortable taking personal credit for the great work he did, preferring to quietly work furiously in the background to get done what needed to be done, because his career was never about him, it was about the people he was trying to lift up. And because of this, Tony was loved. There are so many stories and messages of warmth from his friends and colleagues, and here are just a few that I wanted to share today. Ian Stewart, a close friend who was formerly the MP for Salford and Eccles and then Mayor of Salford, says this: Tony phoned me before Christmas. He must have been in hospital when he phoned, although he didn't mention that. He said he wanted to arrange a meal and a drink with me. I explained that Mez was ill and that we thought she might have COVID. I suggested that he and I should get together as we regularly did, either between Christmas and New Year or early January. He agreed, but then calmly said he loved me and Mez and that I should let her know that. First and foremost, Tony was a true and close friend of over 50 years. He was a real trade union socialist with a good heart and a strong desire to help those in need. He was a statistician by trade, lecturing at the University of Salford when we first met. People were always bemused when they found out he was good at maths. Tony was a product of the post-war Labour government's welfare, state and education system, which he never forgot. I ran his campaign to become the chair of the parliamentary trade union group. I ran his campaign to become the chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party. I had great respect for him as a politician and dear friend. In 1988, Tony was the first politician to be interested in and support the creation of the synergistic social partnership model for good governance and socially just resolution of complex problems.
Well said.
Tony and I were invited to attend our friend Chan Singh's inauguration at the temple president of a Manchester Sikh temple, and we wore turbans together. We looked the part. He was part of that small group of politicians who were often underestimated, underrated and underused in Parliament. His quiet, calm manner belied the gut instinct and passionate reaction to inequality and lack of social justice experienced by oppressed communities, whether at work, in the community, in the UK or in sub-Saharan Africa. He'd been the Minister for Sub-Saharan Africa in the Blair government. He was a genuine internationalist and understood the real global implications and need to battle against neoliberalism at home and abroad. A genuine man of the people and one of the few politicians I will miss sharing a meal and a drink with. Andy MacDonald, who can't be here today, who is recovering from an operation, also asked me to share this funny story. He was so special and a warm character, but there was also a very naughty side to him, and I'd like to share this story about him. I'd missed breakfast, and I was really quite hungry, and was hoping the delicious jerk chicken would be on offer, and headed off to the debate, the cafeteria, in Portcullis House in eager anticipation. But imagine my disappointment when walking up to the entrance to the cafeteria and looking up at the menu board to see the row of usually packed canteen serving stations totally empty. No staff and no customers. There'd been some sort of a problem and services were disrupted, and there'd been no lunch in the debate today. I tried to take in the full extent of this lunchtime disaster. I was standing there, open-mouthed in disbelief, with my hands still outstretched in automatic pilot, poised to pick up a tray from the pile to put my non-existent food on, as if in total denial and unable to compute, while simultaneously scouring the sad notice of temporary closure that only served to reinforce my disappointment, and with it, the dawning realisation that I'd be eating somewhere else today. I must have had a look on my face of complete bewilderment and disappointment in equal measure, when my friend Tony Lloyd, who had observed my frozen form as he made his way through PCH, quietly walked up to my side, still invisible to me, and said very gently and so caringly, with a wicked twinkle in his eye, "Is there a daughter we could ring?" Rest in peace, Tony. And Paul Dennett, the Mayor of Salford, says this: Sir Tony Lloyd was a great man, a person and politician of great integrity, someone who often did the right thing quietly without fear or favour, a great friend of Salford and its people. My thoughts and prayers are with Tony's family and friends at this time. But outside of the world of politics, Tony's real and unending love was for his family, and it is in this context that I first met him. At the age of 5, in Stretford, he was my first ever MP, although I didn't know that at the time when I was running around he and his wife Judith's house, driving everybody mad, playing Shira, Princess of Power, with his daughter Siobhan, who was my friend at school, usually having a row about who was going to be in the role of Shira that day, causing Tony and Judith to have to come and sort out the problem diplomatically. But I remember it was a house and family full of love and warmth, a family who often supported mine. And it was only years later I realised what Tony actually did for a job. And this was important, because growing up, there was a tendency to believe that MPs were in some special class of their own, that people from backgrounds like mine couldn't be MPs. But Tony was different. He was one of us. He was a man of the people, a proud member and supporter of the Irish diaspora in Manchester, and he gave me the courage to believe that if he had become an MP and he could serve to help people, then maybe, just maybe, people like me could do it too. So I send all of Salford's deepest love and prayers to Judith, Siobhan and Harrod, Kieran, Ali, Carmen, Caris, and all of Tony's families and loved ones. And to Tony, you were an inspiration to all of us in this place. And if we can be just 1 ounce of the good man that you were, then I know the world will be a far better, kinder place.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a special politician who gets a tribute covering the whole front page of the Manchester Evening News with the headline, "An example of honesty, principle and kindness." A quote taken by comments from the mother of this house, but echoed by so many in recent days. The tributes have often mentioned what an outstanding public servant Tony was, but also what a good, kind person he was. And he was always ready with a kind word to me in difficult times, and I remember his sympathy, particularly when my mum died. To those of us who have been involved in Greater Manchester politics for a long time, Tony was a giant. His record of public service is unparalleled. As a councillor, MP, and Police and Crime Commissioner and Mayor, he was a hugely respected and influential figure. He'll be missed across Greater Manchester, but also across Parliament. The respect he was held in from all sides of the House has been clear today and in recent days. Perhaps the thing I admired most about Tony was that his contributions were always so thoughtful. They came from a place of principle, and he always had great conviction, but he was always measured and able to look at the big picture with great knowledge and experience. His wisdom will be missed across this House. And as a long-time resident of Chorlton in my constituency, he'll be missed by the local community as well. As a familiar face on Beach Road, he was liked by everyone, and among many other tributes, I was touched to see the following, written by staff from Ludo's Deli on Beach Road. It said, "We're all very sad at Ludo's, one of our loveliest customers, so supportive. I'm already missing him and all the lovely chats we had about everything and nothing. All our thoughts are with his family and friends, as indeed, Mr. Speaker, are all our thoughts today." And finally, he'll be missed by his friends in the bowling green and the other pubs in Chorlton, where he'd like to chat about politics or Manchester United over a pint, and especially by his colleagues in our local Labour Party, who admired and respected him so much.
Yeah. Debbie Abraham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It really is so sad that today we're paying tribute to our dear friend and colleague and my neighbour, Tony. But I think, having listened to so many stories this afternoon, it is an absolute testament to Tony, the person that he is, how strongly people from all sides of the House have spoken about him. And I hope that this provides some comfort to his family and his staff as well, who I know loved him so much. I think one of the things that sticks out is not only the enormous impact that Tony had on British politics, but also in terms of the high regard that he was felt, and that's quite unusual in this place. What has really stood out for me is that almost everyone has said and had an individual story, but also mentioned his kindness, and I absolutely agree with that. My recollections were quite as a new MP, the kindness that he showed to me coming into the House when he was PLP chair. But then as Police and Crime Commissioner, he'd organised a round table on violence against women and girls, and he'd invited me to come along because he knew it was something that I was so passionate about as well. And again, the empathy that he showed to the women that were there for their experiences. His help with a constituency case of a mum who'd lost her son by murder, and the way he was with her, it was quite remarkable. And then most recently, and we knew that Tony was poorly, but I was really keen to organise a Parliamentarians for Peace event, which thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that. And as soon as I sent a message around, he was the first to respond, to say, yes, we must do something, I'll be there. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to be there, but I knew it came from the place that he absolutely wanted to do that. Tony was the embodiment of politics as public service, deeply humble, conscientious and compassionate. And he worked tirelessly in the interest of his constituents, not for himself. As a constituency neighbour, I know the work that Tony put into his work in Rochdale. And he just called me before Christmas, because as I say, we're neighbouring MPs, because there was a particular issue and he needed my help on that and wondered whether the wording of a letter was just right. And the way he was so collaborative, it was quite special. Tony wasn't interested in politics as a game or a sport. He was passionate about changing lives, and our politics being the vehicle to do that. I will always think about his own poignant words when speaking to a young constituent. For me, politics is about all people. It's that sense of human solidarity that matters. If it's not about making people's lives better, don't be a politician. So I ask all colleagues in Tony's memory to redouble our efforts to making people's lives better. Rest in peace, Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first met Sir Tony about 10 years ago, and similar to comments made by my constituency neighbour from Denton and Reddish, I was young once, and I was at the time active in Young Labour. And I was fundraising for Hazel Grove Constituency Labour Party in Stockport, and I remember he didn't know me, and his office was quite helpful, and he made the time to come to Hazel Grove and fundraise for a CLP which had no Labour councillors and a Liberal Democrat MP at the time. And not only did he come, he spent the entire evening with us, and he spoke to each and every person at the fundraiser. In particular, we had a table for young Labour activists, and he went over and he spoke to each and every one of them. And he inspired me, and he inspired many people on that table. Many of them are Labour councillors now and Labour Party activists. His demeanour was very soft. He spoke softly, he chose his words wisely, and many colleagues on both sides of the House have said that we could all learn from the way he conducted himself. It has also been mentioned that he was an internationalist. He believed in a better world for everyone in the UK, but also across the world. I remember inviting him to speak at an event in Manchester at Manchester Mechanics Institute in 2017. It was for the Cuba Solidarity campaign supported by Unison, the trade union. And he came and he impressed us all with his Spanish skills. He delivered parts of his speech in fluent Spanish. He was also able to translate. And I was in awe of him because I've wanted to learn Spanish for a long time and I've never managed to quite get there. But he just, out of nowhere, he was giving the speech and he kept fluctuating between Spanish and English. And that was quite impressive. When I was in the Labour Party Whip's office, he was in my group, and I had frequent interactions with him, and he was always very kind with his time. Unfortunately, when he wasn't well recently, he asked me to be his proxy vote for the Parliamentary Labour Party, and also for a while for the votes here. And I remember my last conversation with him. He was just coming up those stairs into the chamber, and he said to me, we were supposed to have that pint, and I said, Tony, please let me know what works for you, and I'll take you to my favourite pub in Stockport to have a fine pint of cider. And he said, I will. And looking at my WhatsApp messages, one of my last messages to him was on 29th of December. I said, Tony, I hope you're well. Please let me know if you have any availability, and I'd love to go have that pint with you. He didn't respond, and I was a bit disappointed. But then I messaged him 2 days later on the 31st, wishing him a very happy new year. And he responded straight away. And looking at my messages, his last message was wishing me a happy and successful 2024. A lot of people have said, and I agree with them, that he will leave a massive hole in Greater Manchester politics. I think it's bigger than that. He will leave a massive hole in British politics. And it is quite uncommon for someone to be remembered fondly on both sides of the House, particularly a politician. So it's nice to see there are colleagues here from all major parties speaking about Sir Tony's memories. On behalf of the people of Stockport, my thoughts and prayers are with his family, his friends, and his staff members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues have already ably described Tony's internationalism, his socialism, and his trade unionism. But as one of my predecessors as member for Stretford, I want to pay tribute today to his local work, his collegiate nature, and the way that he went about his business. His personal style was unique, but it was incredibly impressive. Mr. Speaker, Tony was a true son of Stretford. Born and raised locally, he was extremely well regarded and conscientious as a constituency MP from 1983 to 1987, even if being born locally made it inevitable that he was a fan of Manchester United, but you can eventually learn to forgive that in a person. He was known locally not only as a man of absolute principle, the person that so many of us are familiar with here, but as a person who got things done for the community. Indeed, during my own election campaign that led to me coming to this place in 2022, Tony, who made frequent visits to the campaign trail, was often recognised by local residents and his time as an MP remembered favourably. What was all the more remarkable, Mr. Speaker, was that he often recognised these residents too, some 25 years after he had ceased his time as Member of Parliament for Stretford. But that was Tony all over. He treated everybody he met with courtesy. He earned respect because he gave it without question. There have been many tributes to Tony in recent weeks, Mr. Speaker, but the one that chimed with me most was from a former member of Tony's staff team when she said that the thing that she admired most about Tony was that he always treated working class people with respect, and that means everything especially to people who have rarely been treated like that before. It may sound like a small thing, Mr. Speaker, but it is less common than it should be and was a mark of the man. I guess in total, Mr. Speaker, I'd known Tony for almost 20 years, but it was when I became the group leader on Trafford Council and Tony was the PPC and then the interim mayor of Greater Manchester that I first saw him in action. That was, as we have heard, an incredibly tough gig. But Tony went about it with his usual inclusiveness, and he was truly exceptional, a famously international person who knew that when all was said and done, for real working people, all politics was local. He understood too that crime was a working class issue, which is what had driven him to become the PPC in the first place. He cared about the people and communities he served, and that shone through, whether in this chamber, in his constituency, or indeed having a pint with him in the beach in Chorlton with our mutual friend, Councillor Thomas Robinson. That spirit of public service shone through. Mr. Speaker, Tony's approach to serving people was the same as his approach to supporting colleagues. Human solidarity, that quiet word, that nod of encouragement, that message to keep going, the phone call that he made to me in November because he'd heard that I was having some issues in the constituency, just to check that I was okay and to make sure that I felt supported. We've heard similar from the member for Haywood and Middleton, and it is something that he also extended to my own mother when she was facing a tough election campaign in 2016. And I know that I will always remember the phone call he made to her at 4 a.m. in the morning, having got the number from Judith, to offer her congratulations on her re-election. He really was an outstanding man, and if I think of the word that I think sums Tony up the most, it is that thoughtfulness, Mr. Speaker. He was an exceptional parliamentarian. He was an outstanding community politician, but above all, he was fundamentally a thoroughly decent man.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard much about the many roles that Tony played in his time in politics, whether the many roles in this House and in the Labour Party as Police and Crime Commissioner, as interim mayor of Manchester. Tony Lloyd was a champion of the underdog, someone we could all learn from and someone who I absolutely looked up to. He was a great friend of mine from his time as Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and as a newbie in this place in 2019 he helped me navigate the corridors and the strange rules that govern this place. The chair of the PLP talked about his tolerance and restraint. Well, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, as Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, during a very difficult period in our politics, we put those qualities to the test many, many times. In the many meetings that I was in with Tony and other political parties in Northern Ireland, there wasn't much tolerance or restraint on display, but he was there to calm us all down. Of course, I think it's important, Mr. Speaker, for me to say also, Tony's interest in Ireland didn't just start when he became Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. It was a decades-long pursuit of truth, justice and peace for the people of our island. The people, his friends in Ireland, will never forget him, as he never forgot us. I was delighted to host him in Derry in a local hostelry for a few pints a few months ago, where we had great crack and told great stories, and to see him again in the Strangers for a pint just before Christmas. Sometimes, Mr. Speaker, we actually met without having pints. But one of the things that stood out to me in those occasions, and the many occasions I saw him since he got sick, we all knew he wasn't well. But he wore it so lightly, and as others have said, he didn't talk about himself or his own illness. He talked about you and asked you questions about how things were going. And if we think about some of the contributions he made in this place at the end of his career, he was talking about arms exports to Israel. He was talking about Rwanda. He was talking about and advocating on behalf of private tenants who were not being treated properly. An advocate for the voiceless to the very, very end. I want to extend our sympathy and love to Tony's family, friends and all who loved him from the people who I represent on our island. Arish J. Goro, Anam, may you rest in peace.
Oh, thank you.
Mike Kidd, I think you've got an announcement to make.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I've got 1,000 stories to tell about Tony, having met him 40 years ago as a member of the Fianna Porrick pipe band in Stretford doing an Armistice Day. But we've saved them for strangers, hopefully, later. My sympathies for Judith, obviously, whose work carries on as the member for Longford in Trafford. But Tony was an active member of the Catholic community here in Westminster, and Father Alexandra has asked me to convey that the Catholic Mass tomorrow night in St Mary the Undercroft at 6 p.m. will be for the repose of the soul of Tony, and that all will be welcome.
Corinne Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I met Tony when we became corridor neighbours after his 2017 election, but I knew of his reputation and was somewhat in awe of that. Indeed, when I worked with him, my Irish Mancunian aunt, Margaret, messaged me to say, "You're working with our Tony," and she was so proud and then told everybody in Middleton about my great rise. 2018 was a difficult time in the Labour Party, in our country and in Northern Ireland, but he assumed the role of Shadow Secretary of State with, as we've heard, his usual calm, professionalism and guiding political principles. Knowing my interest in Northern Ireland, he brought me into the team. Now, it is still a mystery to me when I actually became Shadow Minister for Northern Ireland. There was no announcement. There were certainly no tweets. I'm not even sure, really, the Leader's Office at the time really knew that we went from 2 to 3 people in that team. As we've heard earlier with the aforementioned Steve Pound, I became part of a trio. What a time. Again, maybe stories later. But Tony wasn't going to let a bit of procedure or indeed convention get in the way of some pragmatism and what he thought was needed at the time. He needed and he wanted to have a woman in that team. He was a great supporter of women's equality, and it was such a great pleasure to work with him at that time. And wherever we went, whoever we met, whatever difficult discussions we had, and there were many, with all political parties, it was exactly the same. We met with the political parties, as we've heard. We met with those victims of the terrible violence in Northern Ireland that people experienced and are still struggling to get some justice for. We met with campaigners for a new and different Northern Ireland. We met with the Irish government. We met, as we have heard, with those Tory ministers and had really difficult but always respectful conversations. He was exactly the same in all of those meetings, with all of them. Calm, informed, respectful, and ultimately really wise. Now, sadly, there aren't always enough people interested in this place, in the affairs of Northern Ireland, so we often had a lot of downtime between debates. We were often here quite late when everybody else had gone on to do other things. So we had a lot of time doing that and travelling, and I learnt so much. And I've not met most of the family, but I do feel I know about them. We shared the great deal of love that we both had for our families. And once I remember waxing lyrical, as I'm sometimes wanting to do, but won't do now, about asking his advice about how best to be a good MP, how to use Parliament. Should you stay on the back benches? Should you take the front bench position? Should you go on select committees, PMBs? What should you do best? He stopped, he raised his hand, took a sip of his pint, and he said to me, "Can you do joined up writing?" And, Mr. Speaker, I can. So I said, "I can." And he said, "There's always a job to be done in this place for people who can do joined up writing." And what he meant by that was you have your clear focus on your constituents. There's a job to be done there that he did really well. But after that, you do what you feel is right for you and where you think you can make the most difference. But also enjoy the great privilege you have. I will really miss him for that sense of fun, for that mischievousness, for his great wisdom and friendship, particularly over the last couple of years when he was ill. And as we seem to have all spoken to him and had text in the last few months, so that phone bill must be very high. Tony had no intention of dying in those last conversations, but I also know from the work that he did with me on assisted dying and the right of people to choose their moment of leaving, that that choice to be at home with the love of his family would have been a really important one. So our main thoughts are with the family and close friends. Thank you for sharing. May he rest in peace.
Just to explain to our friends opposite, the reason so many of us love and respect him is because actually for us he was one of the finest socialists and trade unionists we've ever met. But if he was here, I think he'd be saying, look, why aren't you celebrating one of the best attributes he had, which he was possibly the best political plotter any of us have ever come across. It was always plotting for a cause, and it was usually the right cause. And I remember when there was the plot that made him the chair of the trade union group in Parliament, and that was because at that point in time, the then Labour leadership maybe were not as amicable, well, always looked upon, the expression was they always looked upon the trade unions as that uninvited uncle at the wedding that turned up every now and again. And what Tony became was the bridge between the trade union movement and the Labour leadership at that time. And actually it held our relationship together with that movement overall. And then there was the plot to make him chair the PLP, to oust Anne Clewes, if you remember. And it was a Brownite plot. I've got the prominent Brownite beside me. It was a Brownite plot, but it was a good cause. But he saw that the leader actually dominated the PLP, and there needed to be political balance that reflected all the different views and all of that. And then also, we went on to Iraq. A large number of people would not have voted against the Iraq war if it wasn't for Tony, because he led by example as well on every occasion on a very principled basis. And if he was here today talking about Palestine, he'd be leading again on for the Palestinian people themselves. I was in the shadow cabinet with him. He came into the shadow cabinet. If some comrades might remember, there wasn't an awful lot of fight for jobs in the shadow cabinet at that point in time. Fending off the monthly coup took up a bit of our time. But the reason he came in is because he was loyal to the cause and he was loyal to the party. Whoever was leader, he was loyal and he did his job. And we appointed him as Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, because I don't know anyone else who could get this lot in the same room talking to one another in that way. And that's why we loved and respected him, because he was part of us. He was part of our movement, a trade unionist, a socialist, a parliamentarian of the highest degree. He knew how this place worked, and he was able to use this, just as he did the party, for the best of causes and the best of objectives. And that's why we'll greatly miss him. But exactly as the leader of the party has said, the foundations that we lay in the future will be based upon the principles that he advocated and convinced so many people of.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was a bit worried today because I thought I'm going to be overwhelmed with emotion, number one. And number two, I'm going to find out that I wasn't Tony's favourite MP, which was really good. But it's the mark of a good leader and a good man that he made people feel like you were his favourite, that he was telling you something special. And I can't tell you how long I've known Tony, because I've been in the trade union movement for so many years, so our paths crossed all the time, and we were campaigning all the time on so many different issues. But I remember in 2005 when I came into Parliament, and I was quite obviously distressed for something, I don't know what. And I remember Tony putting his hand on my shoulder, like quite gently, and saying, "Dawn, you're often going to feel lost in this place, but don't worry." And he said, if I ever had any questions, I can always ask him, no matter how silly those questions were. And I passed that on to new MPs that came in, always saying, if you've got a silly question, ask me, it's okay. Because I remember how Tony made me feel when he said that. He also told me not to believe people who say they know how this place works, because inevitably they don't. And that I carry with me too. And the last conversation I had with Tony was at the bottom of the stairs by the opposition office. And I remember we had this conversation, and he asked me how I was and how my health was. And you think, oh my goodness, you know, he's going through what he's going through. And then I remember sending him a message, and me and the member for Neath, who I know can't be here today, but she really would want to be here today, we felt quite lost. We didn't know what to do and how to portray to the family. Oh, how to portray how much he meant to us. Thank you.
Mary Rimmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been a real comfort to me to listen to so many tributes to such a wonderful man I have the highest respect for. I've had the pleasure of knowing Tony for many years. It was a joy to work together in Parliament after decades of friendship. He was such a kind, caring and compassionate man. Tony couldn't help himself from helping others. Every day was a day of action to help others to make life things better. Only last month I was at the APPG on Belarus. He corrected me on how I pronounce that. Chaired by Tony. He was fighting as passionately as ever for a free and democratic Belarus just last month. Tony was kind and softly spoken, yet so strong in his beliefs, and actions that always followed them up. Tony was a dear friend to so many people and so well respected, and I am privileged to be one of those people. I always enjoyed chatting over a drink of tea in the tea room, and we'd have many a laugh. I will miss Tony, my real friend. And God bless Tony, and God bless his family. And may you have taken the same comfort that I have had here today, listening to so many well-deserved tributes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to speak today to pass on my condolences to Tony's family, but also to really mark somebody who's one of the standout individuals that I've come across in the 27 years that I've been in this House. I first got to know him soon after I was elected in 1997. We were members of the same trade union group, and he was somebody that you look forward to meeting socially around the place, because he was always good company, but he was someone who was always wise and worth listening to, whether it was in here, in the chamber, or in discussions elsewhere. And I think perhaps when I got to know him best was when I joined the Parliamentary Labour Party Committee, when he was chair of the PLP. And, Mr. Speaker, you'll remember, and those of us who were here at the time, what we went through at that with the expenses issues that where MPs came under considerable amount of criticism. And Tony's leadership really came to the fore there. His calmness and his ability to influence what was going on really was exemplary. I used to sit in the committee, and we would have the civil servant, I won't name him, who had been invited to set up IPSA, who came in to talk down to us, I have to say. And Tony was very calm, as always, and I have to say I wasn't. And I always thought that Tony, in his negotiations, went away and said, look, if you don't negotiate with me, I'm going to set him on you. But his personal skills really got us through that time, and I remember that time very well. And I was also a member of the Justice for Columbia group, and I know that they will want to pass on their sympathies to the family, because he had enormous influence on the work of Justice for Columbia and achieving supporting the peace process in that country, which eventually has made enormous changes there. And Tony was a driving force in that, in both the trade union movement and in this place, in supporting Justice for Columbia. He was the embodiment of the word comradeship, whether it was kindness and decency, his compassion, his courageousness. It all shone through. He was among the best of us, and we will miss him dearly.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, it's been so good to hear all of these very warm tributes to Tony, and he was a man of such warmth and integrity and decency that I think it's resonated through everything everyone's been saying. I got to know Tony when we both served in the Shadow Cabinet, and he was Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary. What really struck me, two things that I would say really. One is, people have said it, the time he would take to listen to people and to consider some problem you were grappling with and to give very wise words of guidance. But also, you know, the degree to which he cared about people so passionately. So for his constituents, you know, he worked tirelessly for them, but also very genuinely for the people of Northern Ireland. And I think that has rung true this afternoon. So I'd just like to express my condolences to all of his family.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think what makes politics interesting for the people out there are great characters, and there is absolutely no doubt at all in my mind that the great Tony Lloyd was a great character. Any time you met Tony and you left Tony's company, you always walked away with a smile on your face, because there was always some witticism that he had left you with to think about. He always made you feel better about yourself and politics. I remember Tony always talking to me, not just of his great love for Greater Manchester, but his love for the city of Glasgow, and of course his other beloved football team, Celtic Football Club, who he insisted was Glasgow's #1 football team. Well, as a Partick Thistle supporter, I can only say to you, Mr Speaker, he was nearly correct in his summation. But he was very proud of his Irish roots, as I am and many others are across this House. And as has been said, his work in Parliamentary Friends of Columbia, I think, where he was the leader for so many of us in this House on raising that particular issue. And I still remember, Mr Speaker, I think we always have to learn from each other. And one of my first conversations with Tony was on the vital importance of a constituency office keeping tabs on the full moon dates across the year. And we all know why, don't we? We can never share it publicly, but we all know why. Full moon dates are a vital part of a constituency office work. Can I say, I'll always remember this great man, this great friend. I hope the WhatsApp messages between me and him are between us and no one else. But can I say to his family, to our Labour colleagues, our comradeship and our love are with you at this time as we remember the great Tony Lloyd.
Jim Schiff.
Speaker, it is a pleasure to make a contribution, and ever mindful of those who have spoken. So on behalf of fellow DUP colleagues and myself in the House of Commons, I'd like to express our sincerest and deepest condolences to Tony's wife Judith and his 4 beloved children and adored grandchildren, some of who are in the House today. Tony's rich service in this House first began in 1983, some 41 years ago, just 2 years before my service started as a councillor in 1985. And it's been well documented and rightly lauded by members. And I wish to very, very briefly highlight the friendship he gave myself and everyone in this House, because he certainly was one who made friends very, very quickly, and it was even more meaningful when we served together on the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. I found his contributions to be incredible. The honourable member for Hayes and Hollington referred to he would manage to have got us all together, and he could do that. From different political parties, bring us together and get us focusing perhaps on the things that we could agree on, rather than the differences that sometimes we have with each other. We were together in Westminster Hall. He very often spoke in debates in Westminster Hall, those on human rights, those on freedom of religious belief, and he and I were often in the same side of the chamber, obviously, but also on the same page when it came to speaking up for those things. He was indeed a voice for the voiceless, and I would often say, boy, did he speak up well, because he really could, and he was very much one of those people. Although Tony and I may not have shared the same political opinion on the way forward in Northern Ireland, we did share respect and love for the country. Tony was knowledgeable on the intricacies of Northern Ireland, and whilst we didn't always agree, his opinion was fair, reasoned and respectful, and we enjoyed many of our conversation, just me sitting here and Tony sitting just behind, and often when I leaned over, and very soft-spoken, incredibly courteous as always personal, and more often had a story. He never gave you advice. If you asked him something, then he helped you, and that was the sort of advice which he often gave to me. I enjoyed that. Tony was a man of personal faith. I know, Mr Speaker, you and the family need to be ever aware that faith's important, and the honourable gentleman from Manchester referred to that there just earlier on. I'm reminded of 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 to 8. And when you think of faith, I think is a great scripture text. He has fought the good fight, he has finished the race, he has kept the faith. Henceforth is laid up for him the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award him on that day. And not only him, but also to all who have loved his appearing. That's the man that we knew, that's the Tony that we knew. Well thought of, respected in this place. His wisdom and wit will be sorely missed.
That concludes the tributes. Can I just say, I think the House has always did its best, and today was exceptional. I know that Tony, and I'm sure the family, are very proud of the way the tributes and the comments have been made. As I said, it will be greatly missed, but never forgotten. be no